Welcome back. It's time for the fourth and final part of the lecture now, where we'll introduce you to some of the basics of feminist theory and sexuality in relation to gender. So to start with, defining feminism. So overall, feminism advocates for social equality between the sexes, or equity. So feminism doesn't advocate for female supremacy or women's supremacy, but it does go pretty hard on the ideas around the mechanisms that sustain inequality. And of course, that means critiquing the social structures and hierarchies of patriarchy that we've been discussing, and looking at how power is arranged around those hierarchies, which means talking about who's at the top. And yes, white men get a pretty bad rap from feminists, and that's because structurally this is how power is centrally located in contemporary societies and cultures. So I've just given you kind of all the background as to why we need feminist theory and the kinds of problems that it seeks to address. So the basic tenets here are that we should work to increase equity and equality. We should seek to expand human choices and opportunities, to eliminate gender stratification, and that basically these drivers of inequality are also the same drivers that produce sexual coercion and violence, gender-based violence. Gender-based violence occurs because of gender inequity and because of the processes of domination and power that are centralized through patriarchy, basically. So looking at all of this means that we kind of understand what the mechanisms are that continue to perpetuate those systems, and that they should be dismantled, and that that's what feminism seeks to advocate for. And also, particularly in the 70s and onwards, sexual freedom has been a really important tenet of feminism, of freeing women from the kinds of sexual roles of submission or of control under monogamous nuclear family and marriage structures. So there are different kinds of feminism that's evolved over a long few hundreds of years. So first wave feminism emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries and focused on the civic inequalities women faced. So this broadly began with the right to vote for women and the women's suffrage movements in the UK, America, and Australia. And second wave feminism began in the 60s and continued into the sexual revolution in the 1970s. Germaine Greer is a very famous Australian feminist from this time period. This was the same time period you might remember when I was talking about the different changes that have happened in society around, this is when women were entering higher education in high numbers because higher education was free during that period of time. That was also when the pill was invented, is when a whole lot of legal changes occurred around to force changes in no-fault divorce, meaning that women could divorce men with no reason, changes to custody arrangements to favour, no longer favour men as a property and children as properties of men. It also introduced definitions of marital rape, which previously didn't exist, and had a focus on violence, domestic violence or gender-based violence as we now call it, and reproductive rights for women. So this is a hugely important time period that we are still sort of seeing the ramifications or rollings of progress from, although of course some of those rights are still continually under threat. For example, in the US with changes to abortion rights, and also in some places in Australia. So third wave feminism began in the 1990s and was characterised by a sort of more intersectional kind of activism, as well as the rise of queer politics, queer feminisms, black politics, that was always there in second wave, or not in second wave feminism, but it was occurring at the same time, but it was not part of second wave feminism. But this started to become more connected up with, or white feminists became more connected with these other groups. So the right girl punk scene in particular in the US was seen to sort of restart this new kind of third wave feminism. This also the same time as the Spice Girls, who was not really part of third wave feminism in terms of driving the politics of it, but there was a kind of particular visibility of girls, girl power, that kind of cultural zeitgeist that was occurring, as though these are the girls who have had the benefits of second wave feminism and now look at them go ruling the world. I mean, we still had Beyonce about 10 years later, who run the world girls. We're still not there. Fourth wave feminism, I guess, is a continuation of this, although there's contention as to whether this is actually a movement or more just a kind of cultural blip. But of course, there were some really significant changes or cultural things that happened around the Me Too movement in the 2010s. There's also been more of a focus here around workplace sexual harassment, work labour politics, rape culture, identity politics, and intersectionality. So Kimberly Crenshaw's work here as a legal scholar, she was the one who coined intersectionality. And this is around looking at the ways that different forms of inequality compound, so that it's impossible to really look at gender as being separate from race, because the ways that inequalities compound, for example, for women of colour or queer people of colour or queer trans people of colour or with disabilities, that all of these things add up, and that we can't really just look at one form of inequality as isolated or separate. That's all being part of the same struggle, but having very different striations or stratifications of how these inequalities play out because of the compounding effects. Fourth wave feminism obviously was occurring around the same time as social media use was becoming very prominent. Social media didn't exist prior to this time. So this is sort of these cultural moments, I guess, were happening at the same time. Also around the same time as broad kind of conversations around post-feminism. So something being post-feminist usually means that it's a celebration of equality being achieved. Yay, feminism worked. Women can do anything now. They kind of lean in Sharon Sandberg, corporate feminism, which of course does a great job of excluding or obscuring the kinds of inequalities we've just been talking about in relation to the domestic division of labour, and all kinds of other forms of oppression and inequality. So I guess there's some political branches of feminism that are important. I guess some factions, perhaps. The kinds of feminisms that critique each other. So liberal feminism offers a critique of patriarchy. It follows on from the reformers of first wave feminism. And they kind of broadly agree that the value system of modern culture, but argue that women are disadvantaged within it. They tend to not find society itself as at fault. So lots of prominent feminist sociologists like Rosalind Gill or Angela McRobbie see liberal feminism as being really individualized and sort of maybe focusing on, say, consumerist expressions of feminism. Buying particular products as being feminist coded, but not really looking at the ways power works. And certainly this kind of feminism historically has been predominantly white. And this is one of the main critiques of feminism broadly, is that second wave feminism was broadly white and actively excluded or diminished the connected struggles of Black and women of colour, and it was sort of a white focused and white supremacist project. Socialist feminism, which has occurred around the same time, I guess the liberal, socialist and radical kinds of feminism we're about to talk about all kind of emerged around the second wave. But socialist feminism argues that class position is significant for women's status and function, that monogamous marriage, this is sort of like a Marxist view similar to the conflict theory we looked at in the first part of the lecture, that it's really about property ownership. We should look carefully at those dynamics, and sees that the family is a kind of expression of broader class relations, and dynamics and hierarchies, and argue that patriarchy and capitalism must be analysed together. And radical feminists tend to argue that not only women disadvantaged, but there's something functionally wrong with the way societies work to continue to kind of perpetuate this system. They argue that patriarchy creates a system where hierarchy and competition prevail. So even if women get into the public sphere, they have to play the boys' game on their own terms. They also focus on the private sphere, emphasising sexual assault and domestic violence as central to the preservation of patriarchy. And historically, in more recent years anyway, radical feminism has not been particularly good at including gender diverse or trans people into feminism. It's often quite exclusive because it's really focused on preserving the category of womanhood as biologically female. So that is a particular point of contention at the moment within feminist scholarship and thought that I think it's important for you to understand. I guess that if we're talking about biological essentialism here is the kind of key foundation of the philosophies underpinning gender inequalities and how we think about all of these issues. I think it's important to think about how that plays into the feminisms that you might encounter. This is a huge area of research, and my close colleague and collaborator on a different project, Akane Kanai, who's now at the University of Warwick, has an excellent podcast and website for her project that I really suggest you listen to if you're interested in feminism as a set of ideas or a set of questions or something you're interested in. There are 4 episodes in this podcast she's produced. It's really beautiful. I've listened to it. It's around intersectional feminism, consumerism, pop culture. There's some really great examples in there and some awesome stories. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's also really about the tensions of identifying as a feminist and trying to live a feminist life, getting it right, getting it wrong, all the kinds of unwritten rules, the power dynamics, the exclusions and exclusions. But yeah, it's really a beautiful thing to listen to. So the last part of the lecture is about sexuality and how we kind of disentangle sex, gender and sexuality as things we're interested in study. So sexuality is not the same as sex or gender. It is sexual orientation, desire, sexual identity, sexual practice. So it's different from your gender identity. Obviously, heterosexuality is the dominant form of sexuality, culturally legitimated, that connects with cisgender identities and people, presentations. So sexuality continues to be regulated by a variety of legal and policing mechanisms. It's no longer illegal to not be heterosexual, but it certainly was for a very long time in Australia and still is in many parts of the world. Some cultures in society attempt to regulate all aspects of sexuality and restrict it to just events between husbands and wives in marriage and for reproductive purposes. So this is certainly the conservative, historically, and agenda that has been most common, I suppose, in the last few decades. And obviously that's been challenged more recently through the marriage equality that was achieved recently, relatively, in historical terms. So we'll go on to look at some theories here around queer theory and which connects to gender, and some other definitions to come. So Judith Butler is a very eminent feminist, queer and gender theorist based in the US. Judith uses they, them pronouns. So male and female behaviour and norms, they argue, are not the result of biology, but are constructed, reinforced and maintained by continuous performance of society and culture by us and by ourselves. This is the kind of theory that I, as a contemporary gender scholar, have been most influenced by, and that you will probably continue to encounter in your university studies if you're looking at gender and sexuality. Their work is fantastic. So they connect up all of these kind of power dynamics I've been talking about around how biological essentialism kind of is the elephant in the room, underpinning all of the, I guess, complications and inequalities and oppressions that extend from our dominant understandings of sex, gender, and sexuality. So they challenge the ways that heterosexuality is constructed as normal and the ways power relationships keep this in place. Queer theory challenges the traditional divide between gay and heterosexual and kind of connects to a long body of work which others like Kinsey, which we'll look at in a minute, have shown how, you know, sexual identity is fluid across different stages of life and sex gender. That it is sort of it has a binary at either end, but there's a huge continuum of diversity across the spectrum. So in Gender Trouble, Butler argues we should challenge or trouble these traditional views because of the harms they cause. And there's also been some interesting political shifts in the period since marriage equality as well, and debates, I guess, in queer communities and in contemporary society as well, or mainstream society, where there's tensions, I suppose, about who is allowed to be diverse in terms of sexuality and gender. Diverse sexualities just sort of absorbed into the existing social structure rather than, you know, society itself becoming more queer accepting. There is still a sense that many queer people feel like they don't want to just be like heterosexual couples and have the same kind of dynamics. Rather, it's the sense of what is normal that needs to be broken down. So instead of just wanting to be accepted or you know, pass in the ways that still do nothing to unsettle the privileges of heterosexuality or cisgender people, that, yeah, it's important to really critique overall gender inequality and biological essentialism that goes along with it. Much of Butler's work is informed by Michel Foucault, who you will also definitely encounter if you're continuing to do any sociology or social sciences courses, which I highly recommend. So these series have really mapped, I guess, the way that sexuality has been understood over a long period of time. Argues that what we currently understand as the norm of sexuality are really reductive and ahistorical. So before the early 20th century, sexuality was not a concept used to classify human beings. It was only around the advent of scientism and post-Enlightenment where these sort of different disciplines to understand and categorize people that I was talking about earlier came to be, that sexuality and sexual behavior came to be a way to classify people. And as you can understand if you see how, you know, concepts of monogamy, marriage, you know, women being property of men, sexuality obviously features there as a form of social reproduction and of gender and power reproduction. So this is one of Foucault and Butler's main points. And Alfred Kinsey was the very well-known sexologist and psychologist in the, I think, 50s and 60s who, well, you can see there, 48 to 53, created this scale where he argued, based on lots of data and studies, that exclusive heterosexuality is just one among many of the different forms of sexual orientation, and that it can be spread across a different person's life to occupy many of these different positions, that people will not necessarily always just be one way or the other. There will be many, many different shades in between. We've already talked a little bit about gender diversity in terms of challenging the gender binary earlier on, but sociologists argue that the links between sex, sexuality and gender are arbitrary. They're socially relevant because they're important to how we present and what we do and how we understand ourselves and are seen and known, but that they're all kind of entangled in relation to power, hierarchies and systems of dominance. So This is again to say there are no intrinsic gendered qualities, because if there were, we would be accepting that some people are naturally inferior to others and should be treated differently and should be sort of marginalised. And we do not live in a society that should condone that, and plus it's just factually incorrect as well. So if sex and gender are not intrinsically linked, then a broader range of expressions must be and are possible, and we're seeing those now, and we'll continue to see those as society progresses. So we've already defined cisgender, transgender and non-binary earlier on. So sexuality and gender in other cultures is also very diverse across time, across current cultures and locations. So some men socially defined as women or other categories altogether. There was the absence of the homosexual prior to the 18th century. There just weren't terms for it. People just, did things and they weren't defined by them. It's the meanings that we attach to these as disciplines, as sciences and as cultures that is really powerful, and that is what we should be interrogating here. So monogamy is also a relatively new concept historically, again around the possession of property and social and political reproduction. It's very, very convenient, works really well. It's still working very well in Australia and other Western contexts. So I guess this is to show there's so much reading you can do further if you're interested in these topics. There's infinite things you can read if you're interested, and I'm sure I hope you will. But to conclude and to, I guess, sum up, so we've looked at how socialization creates and reinforces gender, but gender pathways are also chosen. These socialization isn't guaranteed to be effective, but it also does a lot of heavy lifting, right, in terms of reinforcing and reproducing the dominant gender norms. Patriarchy and the dividend refer to male dominance and the benefits men receive from the subjugation of women. Hegemonic masculinity refers to the various masculine ideals that link masculinity with traits associated with power and success, always defined in opposition to femininity. I think that's kind of the most important aspect for understanding power relations and masculinity is it's in opposition to the disavowal of femininity is crucial to that project and is such a source of damage and harm for men and for women. So while we feel gender often to be a natural expression of who we are, gender is anything but natural. It is the most socially and culturally embedded phenomenon, but we experience it in our bodies. We have our own sense of ourselves that is very much tied to gender because of the society and culture we live in, and we can choose to express that in a range of ways that feel appropriate and comfortable for us. So that doesn't mean to say it's natural, but it should just be something that people are able to comfortably express whatever they feel it to be. That would be my ideal world. Gender is more complicated than man and woman. It's something we do. These are decisions we make, even though we might not feel that they are, or we might feel constrained in those choices. But knowing that everybody is making those same choices, but the relations of power obviously mean there are different costs and punishments and benefits that are associated with different expressions. And importantly, I think hopefully you've got this through the lecture, look out for biological essentialism. It's everywhere, particularly in social media, in the manosphere, in the tradwife, in all kinds of kind of conspirituality theories you might encounter on social media, the return to the kind of good old days where men could be men and women could be women. I feel like there's a resurgence of this happening online and in culture, as there's a kind of tilt towards conservatism in the US and populism in other places here in Australia. So look out for it. If you hear someone saying that's just the way things are, it's the way it's meant to be, it's just natural, it's built in, hardwired, red flag. So that's my message to you. And if you want to get in touch, you have any questions or you'd like any further information or resources, please just get in touch. there's my email address there. So thanks. I'll see you later.